Star Wars Rebel Assault 2 sucks. It pains me to say that because this is one of those games I played a bunch as a kid, but playing it now, it's aged terribly. And it's not because I didn't have very much to play at the time. I had a pretty extensive PlayStation library. But in the 90s, I was just a huge Star Wars fan, and especially in 1996, the Star Wars landscape wasn't anywhere near as expansive as it is now, for better and for worse. This was before the brand had a big resurgence with the special editions and the prequel trilogy. Star Wars games were still pretty experimental, and the majority of them came out on PC. That was where I originally experienced the Rebel Assault games. The original Rebel Assault was a novelty, with its cartoonish cutscenes blended with the then more photorealistic feel that you didn't see a ton in games at the time. Sure, today it doesn't look like much, but in the early 90s, believe it or not, this was cutting edge. But then came Rebel Assault 2, and visually it looked much more impressive. This was classified as an FMV game, more specifically a rail shooter, where the player has very little agency in moving their character, instead moving around a cursor and just shooting anything that comes flying at you. But at the time, this was something special because it was the first new, live-action Star Wars footage that had been filmed since Return of the Jedi. The 2 Ewok movies don't count. And sure, they repurposed a lot of existing footage from the original trilogy, but the majority of this footage was brand new material that was being used specifically for this game. Playing through this game was almost like watching a brand new Star Wars film, or at least a high-quality made-for-TV movie.
Aren't you a little short for a stormtrooper? Shut up.
It's a self-contained tale, understandably not connected to the epic Skywalker saga. The game doesn't explicitly say, but if I had to guess, it takes place a few months after A New Hope. After the destruction of the Death Star, the Empire begins testing on a brand new kind of TIE fighter dubbed the Phantom TIE. After engaging a couple of X-Wings, the Rebel Alliance sends Rookie 1, hero of the first game, to investigate the Phantom fighters. You get to explore the mining facility where the ships are being developed, with the eventual goal being to steal one of the new fighters yourself, so the rebels can study it and use the technology to their advantage. From a plot standpoint, it's not the most epic story, but it was kind of neat to get a glimpse into how the Empire plans on getting retribution on the rebels, one that didn't involve, another big round thing. I appreciated the smaller storytelling as it fits well with a game like this. The thing is, the only reason you'd want to revisit the game today is because of the story. The actual gameplay is another thing entirely. Rail shooters have been around for years, basically since the very inception of video games. And believe it or not, there are ways a rail shooter can be done well. If you think about it, the majority of the Star Fox games were basically rail shooters that give you more control over your ships. The levels basically play the same way each time, once in a while giving you branching paths, and there are, of course, the more open-ended battle sections, but 90% of those games are on rails. Well, the Rebel Assault games don't give the player that much agency, and as primitive as the first Rebel Assault game seems, believe it or not, it actually gives you more variety in the levels than the second outing. With Rebel Assault 2, you basically have 4 mission types. There are what I like to call the tunnel levels, where you're flying through the enclosed areas trying to blow up debris while avoiding the walls. There are the slightly more open flying stages, which are a little more straightforward. These aren't that much different from the tunnel levels. The objective is basically the same, all you're doing is blasting objects while trying not to hit the sides of the screen, but you don't have to worry too much about avoiding objects. You have these third-person stages where you're taking out stormtroopers, and then you have the most infuriating types of stage, the dogfighting areas, where you're basically a sitting duck while you wait for a barrage of enemies to come blasting at you. While there seems to be enough variety for a rail shooter, every stage suffers from the same problem: poor hit detection and awkward controls. Depending on which version you play, the first Rebel Assault typically has piss-poor controls too, but at least on PC you have the convenience of a mouse and keyboard. That was how these games were meant to be played. If you've ever tried moving a cursor with a D-pad, then you already know how frustrating cursor-based games can be on consoles. But when you're repeatedly firing at objects only to keep missing what should be an easy target, the frustration only intensifies. Look at this. You see how many times I've hit those fighters? And half the time my lasers completely miss their mark. The cursor feels kind of floaty, but it also feels like I have to press the fire button seconds before I intend to hit my target in order for the hit to register. And when you have a half dozen chips all firing at you on all cylinders, this can be frustrating. And to my knowledge, there's no way of dodging their attacks. You seem to get hit at pure random, and only through a string of lucky shots can you then advance to the next level. But getting through one of these dogfighting stages without taking a ton of damage is a chore. At the beginning it doesn't seem that bad, but when you get into the later stages, these are rage-inducing. The same thing happens in the third-person stages. Sometimes my laser blasts hit their target, and sometimes not. Look at how many times I hit this stormtrooper. It's really inconsistent. And yes, in these stages you're meant to be able to take cover so as not to get hit, but it's still near impossible to get through a level without taking a ton of damage. These free-for-all flying stages aren't too bad, and I actually enjoy them, but again, the controls are kind of broken. Your ship keeps wanting to veer to the right or the left, so you don't really feel like you're controlling your ship. It's more about trying to keep your ship centered so you can avoid crashing into the mountains, or more accurately, the sides of your TV screen. The tunnel sections are also kind of fun. I like this level that keeps repeating until you can take out all of the shield generators. Here, the hit detection doesn't seem to be that bad. I can more or less hit stuff, but what sucks here is trying to dodge the walls. Even if I move in the direction that your partners recommend, you can still take damage. Even if it looks like I'm about to clear an obstacle, I can still get hit. The most annoying version of this is in the asteroid field, because every Star Wars game at the time had to have an asteroid field stage. Even Shadows of the Empire had an asteroid field. But on rails, dodging asteroids is easier said than done. Once again, I can hit almost all my targets, but dodging asteroids isn't as easy as you'd think, and more times than not, no matter how far over I pull my fighter, I tend to take a hit. The presentation is what I remember most about this game. Hey, I have a fondness for these kinds of FMV-driven games because I realize they're a gimmick, but there's also a charm to them that doesn't exist today.
Save the state some money on that one.
Sure, most of these kinds of games lack the in-depth gameplay of today's AAA titles, but this was a time where video games were just trying to impress audiences with impressive new technology, and while a lot of these games have little to offer younger players, it was an attempt to use video games as a way to tell stories. But some games you can smell a mile away, and I'm sorry to say, but Rebel Assault 2 just hasn't aged well.